So I wanted to share some things about how to manage anxiety, anger, and addictions. It's actually a very important piece, not so much about the techniques of managing those very, very powerful emotions and cravings. It's more about the foundation to understand what your body's doing so that the techniques that come later will make sense and you'll understand why they're so important. So what we have here is a graph of what happens when we get really anxious or scared, really angry, or when we're really ramping up with that craving for addiction. Okay? Now, when I first developed this, it was really to explain to a 6-year-old who was having fist fights in the playground how to manage his anger. So I told him, there's this guy over here, and he's walking along, and he wants to get over here. But he comes across this boulder, this thing that gets in the way, and he starts to get upset about it. And so he has to go climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing up this mountain, and he's getting more and more and more upset. And then he gets to the point of no return, and he just loses it. And then afterwards, he's not feeling so good. So what does this represent? It takes a long time for him to get his energy back and get to where he wants to go. It's this obstacle to where he wants to get to go. And anxiety, anger, addictions often function that way. What this actually is a graph of arousal in our body. It's what happens in our body when our adrenaline system gets turned on. So let's just say that you're walking through the forest and all of a sudden there's a tiger in your path. What do you have to do? Well, most people say run. Right, run like hell. Oops, heck. Most people will say run like heck. So that's the flight response. Or if the tiger catches up to you, you're going to have to really fight hard for your life. That's the fight response. And actually there's another response now that we understand, which is the freeze response. So for those of you who took biology in high school, this may sound familiar. This is what our adrenaline system gets us to do. Fight, flight, or freeze. Because when this trigger and you see that tiger in your path, your body has to get you ready to do at least 2 out of these 3 things. So some of the things that happen is your heart rate goes up, your breathing gets very fast because it's trying to get all of this oxygen to the major muscles of your body. It's getting all of the oxygen to the major muscles of your body. It's taking away the blood from your internal organs because it needs it to go elsewhere, so we can have gastrointestinal upset and so forth. And the most important thing to notice about this is your brain's going to get hijacked. So your amygdala, which is in your brain, which is part of that danger system, it's going to hijack your whole brain. Your whole brain is going to operate differently. The brain flow changes, and you're going to get focused on what? On the danger, and just on the danger. And that's because we have to be thinking about what the tiger's doing, not our homework, what's for dinner, except maybe us. But we have to get very focused on the danger, so we get this tunnel vision on the danger, and our brain is hijacked. And so one of the other things that happens is as our arousal goes up, our judgment goes down. So down here we have pretty good judgment, but as our arousal goes up, our judgment gets very poor judgment, because we lose our perspective. It all gets tunnel vision. Our body is getting ready to expend a lot of energy in a very short space of time. That's what our body is doing in this escalation or ramp up phase. And then we get to the point where we have to release that energy. Well, what happens if there is no real tiger there? Where are we going to put the energy? And so we have this explosion of energy up here, which might be the anger, or it might be the panic attack, or it might be giving into that craving and I just have to go act out and do whatever substance to manage all this stuff that's going on, okay? So after the point of no return, there's this hitting the ceiling, all right? So what does that look like? For some people, well, think about it. What does that look like for you when you've hit the ceiling, you've gone, as you know, you just lost it? For some people who are angry, it looks like hitting, yelling, crying, swearing, pushing. So that's one form of anger. Another form of anger, though, is the avoidance response. It's the flight. It's the withdrawal. So some people get very quiet, and some people withdraw, and they can't talk. Sometimes they actually get a little frozen. Okay? So make a little list for yourself of what for you means past the point of no return. What is it that you don't want to have in your life? You don't want to have it anymore. This is what we're looking to avoid. Okay? So once you've really lost it and you've had the panic attack or the temper tantrum or whatever it is, I always ask people, how do you feel afterwards? Do you feel really great, full of life, full of energy? Usually not. Usually we feel very low energy. We feel depressed. We may feel shame. We may feel guilt. We don't feel really good. This is hitting the floor. So we hit the ceiling, then we hit the floor. And it takes a little while to build up that energy because this is exhaustion. This is adrenal exhaustion. We've had this huge burst of energy at the top because we thought we were dealing with a danger. And then we have this exhaustion afterwards. And it takes a little while to get our energy and keep going to where we want to go. So this is a very important process for understanding how we intervene because we don't want to be on this roller coaster. Now, I ask people, where's the best place to intervene? Think about it. This little T down here stands for trigger. This is what sets us off. Do we do something before the trigger? After the trigger? Some people will say, well, let's just intervene before the trigger. Let's avoid what gets me mad. And by the way, it's really good. My homework sheet has a list of what makes me upset, what makes me mad, what makes me anxious, what are my triggers. We'll talk about triggers in a minute, a little bit more. But some people will say, well, let's get to it before the trigger. And that's not so bad, because if we take that list of triggers and we problem solve around them, then there are some that we can in fact remove the trigger. The problem is that I can't tell the guy who just cut me off on the freeway to pull over so that we can talk a bit and do some problem solving about what's going to happen, so that he doesn't cut me off again. So there's some triggers that we can't avoid. For that trigger, for example, I was in fear of losing my life, but I can't avoid what other people do. So sometimes we're going to get triggered whether we like it or not. Now some people say, well, how about intervening up here? And you know what? A lot of parents like to do that. Because what happens is the kids are playing nicely, we're doing whatever we need to be doing, everything's cool, and then all of a sudden we hear them fighting, right? And we go in there and we're gonna break up the fight. And we want them to sit down and talk to each other nicely. But it's not likely to happen because they're past the point of no return already. We're catching them up here, not down here. So some people will say, how about in between here, in the escalation point, the phase? And that's a really good response. Because if we can notice that the arousal is building up, we haven't got to the point of no return, and we take a time out, we can take out what I call the kids. I say to the kids, it's a timeout shortcut. It's not the kind of timeout where you're going to get in punishment. It's a timeout to allow the arousal level to drop. Because here's the good deal. Your adrenaline gland can't keep pumping out that adrenaline forever. If you change your focus and your situation and you pull away a little bit, then your adrenaline gland, it's not looking at the danger anymore, so your arousal level can come down. And when our arousal level comes down, then we can use what I tell kids is the talk it out bridge. And now we got our brain back because it's not hijacked anymore, and we can talk it out. What are we going to talk about? What made us mad? What made us anxious? Okay, so that's a general idea, but there's some details that are very important. For example, sometimes it's not just one trigger that sends us up to the point of no return. Sometimes what happens is we're late for school or work, and then we get a bad grade, or our boss is mad at us. We find out we forgot to pay a bill or forgot to do some homework. Our colleague is giving us an attitude, or our friends are ignoring us. And then we come home and we find out that the dog has knocked over the trash bin all over the driveway and somebody's got to clean it up. Okay, now we're here. Now we're this far away or over the point of no return. So the important thing to understand about arousal is it's cumulative. Most men who hit their wives are very unaware of this cumulative arousal that's going on. Very often men who hit their wives or hit their partners have experienced unemployment, other stress in their lives and so forth. They're totally out of connection with their bodies. And so for them, it's like trigger and I'm off in 2 seconds, right? 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. But that's not really what's going on in our body. That's what's important to understand, is that this arousal is cumulative. And because it's cumulative, we can intervene in this space to keep the arousal down. And basically the things that we do in timeout are also the things that we can help keep this baseline down. So I want you to think about some things that you maybe already do to chill out, to calm down, okay? Sometimes people will say, okay, so they might leave the room, and we'll talk about in a minute how we take a time out in a relationship. But so sometimes just changing your space, okay? So say go to my room. Believe it or not, some kids I even allow to play video games. Except of course, if they're getting into trouble for playing the video games, then that's not okay, that's kind of cheating. But what I tell parents is it's whatever it takes to help that child start to self-regulate their level of arousal, okay? So whatever it takes to bring this arousal down. One of the techniques that I teach in my office, won't be on this video, maybe in another video, but is a deep belly breathing technique. And the deep belly breathing technique is very effective at short-circuiting this arousal mountain, this roller coaster. Because what it does is it turns on the rest and relax system in the body instead of the danger system. So the deep belly breathing, and I just put DBB down here, okay, helps the adrenaline gland turn off. Here's the thing, lots of people have tried breathing. They don't always do it from the diaphragm. It has to be from the diaphragm. So that's another, like I said, another whole technique video. But they try it up here. It's a lot harder to bring yourself down to here if you're starting up here. So you have to do the deep belly breathing as you're aware of that arousal mounting so that you can bring it down again. That's why this understanding what's going on in your body is so important, and being in touch with what's happening in your body so you can catch it early. So in my office, we work on a lot of timeout things that you can do to step away. And what most important is to step away in your thinking. Because if you're triggering yourself over and over and over again by thinking about what made you upset, right? Your brain doesn't know the difference between reality and not reality. So you're triggering yourself over and over again. You're not really stepping away. So we want to find activities that completely change our focus just for a little while so that our arousal can come down. Now let's talk a little bit more about triggers. This is really important. So triggers for anxiety and anger share a lot in common. If we talk about anger, I like to talk about anger as a camouflage emotion, okay? So all it's doing is it's covering up some very more important feelings, some deeper feelings. Now anger makes us feel powerful. We like to feel powerful, right? But usually the trigger has to do with a loss or a threat of loss. So what are the feelings associated with loss? That's hurt, sadness. Threat of loss, anxiety, fear. People don't like to feel sad or hurt or anxious or fearful. They much rather feel angry because we feel powerful. We feel like we can do something, right? The problem is that often the anger is not very helpful because it's just camouflaging the real issue that's at stake here. So one of the things that's helpful in writing out your list of your triggers is asking yourself, what loss or threat of loss is underneath my anger? Now, it so happens that sometimes, actually a lot of times, anxiety can also be a camouflage for anger. Now, here's what I want you to know. Anger is an appropriate response when we're faced with a danger. It is a motivation for us to push against. And it's an important feeling, and it's an important thing we want to hang on to when we have to set boundaries, when we have to protect ourselves. Like, hopefully we don't have to go to anger to do that. That's part of what we learn in my office, is you don't have to go all the way up here to set a boundary, to say no, to make it stick. But it's very important that we have that motivation to set a boundary. Well, sometimes we're not given permission to do that. Anger is not okay. Or anger has been associated with something so huge that somebody was going to get hit, hurt, killed, whatever. So we don't feel comfortable with anger. We don't like the fight response. So we go to the flight response. We go to anxiety. So sometimes anxiety actually covers up some pretty legitimate angry feelings about something, a boundary that's been crossed, some injustice that's happened, but we don't have the permission to feel it. So the more we feel secretly angry, the more anxious we get, because we're afraid of letting it out of the bag. We're so afraid of this explosion up here that we turn it into anxiety. So understanding what is really at the root of this arousal is very important. When we talk about addictions, then we're talking about a trigger that makes us want to crave that substance. It can be the anger, the anxiety, the guilt, the shame. Lots of different things here. But what we're using is the substance to take down our arousal very, very often. Very, very often what I meet in my office is that people actually have an unmedicated anxiety disorder, like social anxiety. That's a classic one. I have social anxiety, so when we go out to the bar, I drink. It makes me feel better. I can relax. I can talk to people, right? But then if we start to become dependent on that, now we have a problem. So often alcohol or substance abuse is an antidote to our anxiety, or to our anger, or to our loss and our sadness, or to our shame and our guilt. And there becomes a cycle with addiction that we cover up. We feel bad when we act out, then we have guilt and shame over it, and now we have to deal with the guilt and shame. We don't know how to do that, and so we reach out to the substance and we do it all over again. So we've got our trigger list, and we're kind of working on that. We're working on paying attention to our body and the physiological sensations. Here's what I want you to understand, especially if you suffer from anxiety. This is a physiological process, and guess what? We can have control over it. We can intervene in this process in your body and bring down that arousal so that you don't have to be up here. We've talked about things that we can do during timeout, which, by the way, end up being things that help this baseline stay low. We want to stay as far away from this as we can. So we have to take responsibility for noticing what that arousal is in our body so that it doesn't accumulate. So things like mindfulness, meditation, exercise, playing with your dog, creative things, doing art, doing dance, going for a walk, enjoying nature, getting outside of the house. All of these things are very, very important for our mental health so that we can take a time out on a consistent basis in our life and keep that arousal down at a baseline so that when something comes along, we're not cruising 2 inches away from the point of no return. So you might remember that I mentioned that I used this model to help a 6 or 7-year-old who was getting into fights on the playground. So the biggest and most important intervention here was that after he learned what was happening in his body, we helped him identify that as he was starting up the mountain, he would start to clench his fists. That's when he knew he was starting to get upset. And so we had a rule that if he was clenching his fists, he had to go immediately and talk to the playground monitor and talk about what made him mad. And then he stopped getting into fights because he was able to understand his body and intervene and notice those signals. So it's a very important part of your homework to start noticing what happens in your body down here when you're starting to get upset. So that might mean that you notice your heart start to race a bit. Maybe your voice gets a little louder. Or maybe you're one of those person who starts to shut down and gets a little quieter. We want to catch it at the beginning when we notice those physiological symptoms. Sometimes you'll have a funny feeling in your tummy. Sometimes you feel hot and sweaty. Sometimes there's lots of different things that people can feel. And what you want to find out is, what does your body do when you start to get upset? Because then that becomes your red light so that you can take the time out. So now I want to talk about how to take that time out in a little bit more detail. And this is especially important when you're having conflict in a relationship, okay? Obviously, the first step is noticing that you're getting upset. And so you can say to your partner, I'm getting upset. You need to say that, okay? You don't want to just run out the door and take a time out, because you'll leave them standing there feeling very, they don't have closure. They may feel that you've abandoned them. They may be worried for your safety, all right? By the way, when people do that, when they're in a conflict and they just kind of, I gotta go, or they just leave, or they stop talking, it's because they're trying to regulate their arousal. I've had a lot of men in my office say, well, I don't want to get to a point where I'm so angry that I do something stupid, so I leave. So in a sense, they're taking the flight option so that they can regulate their arousal. But what I'm talking about here is a little bit more planned timeout, okay? Where we take a timeout from the conflict, because we know if it keeps escalating, nobody's going to have their brain. It's going to be hijacked. Nobody can think straight, okay? We're not going to be hearing each other. We're not going to be doing great communication. We're just going to be doing all this yelling and acting out. We don't want to go there. So for the person who's getting angry, you can say, I'm getting so angry, I need a timeout. Or I'm getting so upset, I need a timeout. So it's very important, first of all, to communicate with your partner that it's you that's having the problem, not them, not you need a timeout, but I need a timeout. And second of all, where you're going to be, what you're going to do. So I'm going to go to the gym, for example, for an hour, and I'm going to work out. And then third of all, you have to make an appointment to come back and talk it out. Okay? So it might be, how about we talk about this after dinner when the kids are in bed? If you're still angry at that time, and that's you that's being the speaker, then you can come back at another time and just say, you know what, I'm not ready yet. Now there's another whole piece that I teach in my office to couples and to individuals about identifying what you're feeling, how to communicate it in a good way. There's a whole piece about how do we talk it out in a respectful way that's constructive. We don't have time for that here, but I want you to see that when we take that time out, we need to take responsibility for it, communicate it to our partner, and tell them where we're going to be, and make an appointment to come back. Now, if you happen to be the partner and the other person is getting pretty escalated, you can also take a time out. You can say that exactly the same thing. I'm getting so upset, I need a time out. I would like to make dinner and feed the kids, and how about we talk after dinner and come back to this later when we can be more constructive. Okay? So either person can call a timeout. Here's another important rule. You have to respect your partner's timeout. Because if they're trying not to go up to the top of the mountain and you're chasing them up the mountain, that doesn't do anybody good. Okay? So you respect that they take a timeout, and you respect that they need some time to bring their arousal down, and get their thoughts together. So now you can have an intelligent conversation about the conflict. Now, what do we do when we're talking about kids? Well, this can get really fun with kids because our goal here is to teach kids how to self-regulate. So what I do with kids is I set up this really great program where they get stars and rewards for managing their anger appropriately. Okay, so it's especially helpful with anger. Anxiety, we take a different approach. So what we say to them is, if you say to mom or dad, I'm getting so mad, I need a timeout, I'm going to go to my room for a while, they get 3 stars on their star chart. Okay? If mom or dad has to say, and mom and dad can say, I think we need a timeout. If mom or dad says, I think you need a timeout, and the child goes with a good attitude, they get 2 stars. If mom or dad says, I think we need a timeout, or I think you need a timeout, and they go, but they have a bad attitude, they still get 1 star. And if it eventually gets to the point that mom or dad observe that they're in a situation that normally they would have gotten angry or upset, and they don't, they get 4 stars. And so what we're doing is we're rewarding, technically, successive approximations to the goal. In other words, we're rewarding their attempts to manage their own behavior. And this becomes fun, and it's a great way to motivate kids and help them to become aware of their anger. But of course, parents need to do their job too. They need to help the child notice when they're escalating. Because remember, a lot of people who get angry don't even notice in their bodies that they're escalating. And we can give lots of tools for kids to take down their arousal. Jumping jacks, running around the block, whatever. There's lots of ways to expend this energy without getting into inappropriate behaviors. So I hope this has been helpful in understanding the foundations, the physiological foundations, what's happening in your body when you're getting anxious, when you're getting angry, when that craving is building up. And I want you to know that you can learn how to be in charge of this process. You can influence this so that you don't have to end up here all the time. So another piece of this is very important, is figuring out what's going on in your body and paying attention to this, paying attention to this escalation process. So I want you to think a little bit about, what do you notice when you're first getting upset? Not when you're up here, all the way up here, but what do you notice as you're first starting to get upset? Because that's going to be our stoplight, right? We don't want the stoplight up here, we want it down here that tells us to stop and take a time out. So I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I used this with a 6 or 7-year-old who was getting into fights on the playground. And we were able to help him identify that he recognized he was getting upset when he started clenching his fists like this. So we had a rule that as soon as you notice you're clenching your fists, I want you to go talk to the playground supervisor about what's making you mad. And he stopped getting into fights on the playground.